Welcome to Partner Path, a podcast that unpacks the venture capital and growth equity ecosystem from a junior perspective. Young entrepreneurs and investors have already had a massive impact on the industry, having started unicorns and launched billion-dollar funds. We discuss these success stories and more by sharing perspectives and advice from some of the industry's most prominent role models.
We are excited to have on John Melas-Kyriazi, CEO and co-founder of Standard Metrics. John spent his undergrad years at Stanford, where he stuck around to pursue a master's and Ph.D. in material science and device physics. While at Stanford, John spent his time helping lead StartX, a community of entrepreneurs and professors associated with Stanford. In 2014, John joined Spark Capital in Boston, where he went on to lead 4 investments and source another 5. After 5 years at Spark, John left to start his own company, Standard Metrics, which is a portfolio collaboration tool for venture capital firms. Welcome, John.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. So let's start with your experience at Stanford. You ended up staying there for 7 years, where you studied material science and device physics of solar cells. Can you explain what you studied within material science, device physics? Just break down what those terms mean.
Sure, yeah. So my path to studying physics was a strange one. I never expected to study physics. I actually didn't particularly enjoy physics as a subject in high school. And my freshman year at Stanford, I got pulled into this environmental movement that was happening on campus, where a lot of students were really interested in clean energy. And through that, I started seeing how much technology was making an impact and started wanting to understand how clean energy technology worked. So I took a class my sophomore year on solar cells, fuel cells, and batteries. And it was so exciting. And I was kind of a pre-med at the time, and I ended up pivoting everything and going and studying applied physics. And then I was really fortunate to get an internship at this incredible lab. This professor named Mike McGee built an incredible lab there and started doing research, just helping out with various projects that were going on. One of those projects was figuring out how to build and how to understand this new type of solar cell, which is called a dye-sensitized solar cell. And this was back in 2009, I think, when I started working on this. And I was really, really fortunate that this lab was doing cutting-edge research. I started helping out with projects. Those projects started achieving publishable results. So I published a paper pretty early on as a second author. So I wasn't the primary author, but I helped out with the project. And then I got the chance to lead my own project, which involved a trip to Switzerland over a summer, doing a bunch of work there, and ended up publishing a paper as a first author. What I was looking at was basically trying to understand how these devices worked. Because what's cool is you can build devices sometimes that do certain things, but you just don't understand how they work. And then you can go and run a bunch of experiments to get at the functionality. So what we were studying essentially was these devices that almost operated like plants, where in a plant, there's photosynthesis that occurs. There's a pigment. That pigment is excited by sunlight, and then that excitation creates a gap in energy, and that's captured. What plants do is they create starch and other types of things that essentially are fuel for the plant. And in a solar cell, what we were doing was we were producing electricity. We were trying to figure out some of the fundamental questions for essentially how this excitation and energy yielded a electric current. What are all the different mechanisms for loss? How can we make these devices work better and ultimately create more energy efficient devices that would create more affordable and more impactful energy conversion devices? So that was what I focused on in undergrad. And then in my PhD, which I never finished, I was researching a different type of, at the time, I think like hypothetical device, which would basically convert water into hydrogen and oxygen at a high temperature. And you take steam and you turn it into hydrogen and oxygen, but using sunlight as the driving force. So imagine devices out in the desert getting super hot, funneling tons of sunlight, and then essentially piping in water, turning it into steam, and then piping out hydrogen that could be used for fuel. So that was what I worked on during my brief stint as a PhD student.
Interesting. And so then you had a pivot where you started to help with StartX. And was that still focused on the environment and this passion for solar energy?
It wasn't. There were definitely aspects that came into play, which I can talk about. So what I did is I was in the lab all throughout undergrad. Every summer I was researching in a lab. During the school year, I was researching in labs. But before my first year of my PhD, my senior spring and senior summer, because I stayed at Stanford for my PhD, I participated in this amazing program called the Mayfield Fellows Program. Basically, there's 10 or 15 people per class, rising seniors, and grad students also. And one of the parts of this program, which is focused on entrepreneurship, was go get a job at a startup as an intern. So I went my senior summer and got a job as a startup as an intern. It was my first time working in a startup. And it blew me away. It was so fun. It was so exciting. It was a solar energy focused startup. And when I got back to school in the fall, I just couldn't stop thinking about startups. And I decided that I wanted to get back into startups. So that's when I ended up going to work at StartX, first part-time, and then ultimately full-time when I left my PhD program. StartX did actually support and continues to support a bunch of companies that are in the clean energy space. So those are ones that I took a lot of interest in. But I actually ended up spending a lot of my time just helping think through how to scale StartX itself as an organization. How should we raise money? How should we think about staffing? How should we think about our program? And it was a really fun experience.
Yeah, can you actually double click on what StartX is, why that ecosystem is so special at Stanford?
Yeah, so StartX is a nonprofit community that is affiliated with Stanford University, essentially helps students, recent alumni, professors, all sorts of folks who are affiliated with the university accelerate their startups. So in some sense, it has similarities to programs like a Y Combinator or Techstars insofar as it's like a batch-based accelerator program, but a lot of it's quite different. So for example, it doesn't charge any fees, it doesn't take any equity from companies. Instead, it generates revenue through a variety of sponsorships from venture firms and corporations and things like that. It also focuses on different stages. So it's not just like really early stage companies. There are also later stage companies that generally were started by Stanford alumni that can come and participate in the community. And they might be looking for slightly different things. They might be thinking a little bit more about partnerships or recruiting or acquisitions. And so there's this mix of different stages that occur. When I joined StartX, it was about a year and a half old. This is the beginning of 2012. And it's now well over 10 years old. And it's been really cool to see the program grow over the years.
Thanks, that's helpful. And so fast forward to 2014, you moved to Boston to join Spark Capital. It would be great if you could walk us through how you made the decision to join Spark and just touch on the investment strategy. Why was it attractive to you?
The reason I moved to Boston is because my then girlfriend, now wife, Christina, was going to go attend business school at HBS. We've been dating for a short period of time, but I knew she was the one. So I decided I'm going to pack up my bags and move across the country. I had actually grown up just outside of Boston. So it was like familiar territory for me. And I actually didn't know that I wanted to be a VC at the time. I just knew that I wanted to move to Boston. So I started interviewing with various folks, companies, bigger companies, smaller companies, some venture firms. And I got introduced to Spark through a friend of mine who had worked at Spark previously, Rob Go, who started NextView in Boston. Ended up connecting with the team there and really, really resonated with a bunch of different things. One, they had just started building out a West Coast presence and they were investing in building out a West Coast presence, but they were originally Boston based and they'd also built out a New York office. So I really liked the fact that they had this Boston roots, but were expanding to the West Coast because I had spent 6-7 years out on the West Coast prior. Also, they invested in really, really amazing products. They invested in companies like Oculus and companies like Twitter and took these bold bets on amazing, new, different, edgy products. And I thought that that was really, really exciting. And they weren't also afraid to invest in companies that had technical risk. And many of the partners at Spark were in our technical background and were able to grapple with R&D risk in a way that many investors aren't. And that was something that really appealed to me as a technical person too. And then I also just really liked the team and thought that they'd be really, really fun to work with. So that's why I decided to join. And Spark had just raised their first growth fund at the time. When I joined, it was just Jeremy who started the growth fund, who's running it, and then built out a team over the years. So it's a really fun period to be at Spark as the firm had Twitter had just gone public, Wayfair had just gone public. They just raised this big growth fund and then had an extremely productive last 9 years or so.
Yeah, and I would say it was a successful stint at Spark, sourcing deals, leading deals, holding board seats. So if you could touch on sourcing, what was your tactic for sourcing investment opportunities at Spark?
I spent a lot of time sourcing. That was definitely probably where I focused most of my time throughout my 5.5 years with the firm. And one of the things that I really appreciated about the firm was that that was also what most of the senior partners did as well. I remember companies coming in and asking, oh, how do we meet this company? And one of the partners had cold called the CEO and got them on the phone and convinced them to come and talk with us. So it's very much a culture of not being afraid to reach out to entrepreneurs and introduce yourself. So that's something that I did a lot of. I'd say my sourcing techniques, I had a bunch of them. One of the big ones for me was leveraging folks in my network who I knew from school and from StartX who were investing at earlier stages, like pre-seed and seed and angel, asking them what their most interesting companies were, and then following up with them if it seemed appealing to go and talk to. So I did a lot of that, spent a lot of time with friends who were earlier stage investors. That was one big one. Another thing that I did is I just would reach out to companies. I would just email them and say, here's why I'm interested in your business. And I would send them very genuine, well-researched cold emails. And honestly, the response rate on those was extremely high. Sometimes you would have to try hard to get in front of somebody, but in general, it was really exciting because I got to go and spend time with a bunch of really cool entrepreneurs. And that encouraged me to want to go and reach out to more. So yeah, I ended up spending a lot of time on sourcing and really enjoyed that aspect of the job.
And fast forward a few years, now you are founder of a company yourself and sitting on the other side of the table. Curious how your view of successful sourcing tactics has changed now that you're a founder yourself. And I'd imagine you probably get a few of those emails a day.
I actually talk with a lot of investors because we're also selling a product to investors. It's actually kind of nice because I have an opportunity to build a relationship with a prospective investor and then also tell them more about our software and see if they want to buy our software. We've actually met prospective investors in the past who haven't invested but have bought our software. I end up taking a lot of those calls. From my perspective, the most important thing with a cold email or cold outreach is how much time someone has spent being thoughtful about what their angle is for reaching out to you. If it's just, hey, this is what my firm does, I'd love to talk. If it's an amazing firm that you've heard of, that you're really excited to talk to, you're probably going to go talk to them. But if you've never heard of the firm before and there's no context, then it's kind of hard to prioritize that. But if someone reaches out from a firm that you've never heard of before that says, hey, I read about what you're doing, I read this case study, I also actually spoke with a couple of your competitors. Here's my thesis around how this space is kind of playing out. Here's some investments we've made that are actually relevant that you might want to think about talking to. Also, I spoke with my CFO beforehand, and we're actually interested in this general area. And over the next year, thinking about implementing software, and we'd love to learn more about that. Then it's like, of course, I want to take your call. You have all these insights and all these thoughts. Honestly, just the amount of time and energy someone spends prepping makes a huge difference in response rates or just like how quickly I'd want to go and spend time with somebody.
Yeah, totally. Very helpful. Moving along from sourcing into just general movement from associate towards principal and partner. You started at Spark as an associate and moved your way up and also helped lead deals in addition to sourcing rather. What advice would you give to someone looking to make that transition from an associate to a more senior person in an investment organization looking to lead deals? What key attributes or skills did you learn that helped you elevate within Spark?
I feel really grateful to my partners for giving me the opportunity to lead a number of investments on behalf of the firm. That was a really exciting experience for me. At the end of the day, there's a couple of things that folks are typically looking for in order to give people that opportunity. One is probably sourcing investments that do well. I was really fortunate to source a number of investments in companies that ended up going and growing a lot and raising a lot more money. One example is Andela, where I sourced their Series A investment. They now have like thousands of employees. So there's a couple of examples of places where I was able to create value like that. That's a really helpful thing if you want to make that leap. I think another thing is just in general, like partners like trusting your judgment, or at least trusting your judgment enough to want to give you the opportunity to start to get your feet wet and building your own track record. And that's, something that's like earned over the course of years. Serving on boards with partners is also really helpful. That was something that I did a lot in the early days and my partners were great about this, was like, hey, do you want to tag along and join these board meetings? Or, hey, you sourced this deal that we invested in. Why don't you serve as an observer on the board and not be the primary board member, but be kind of like the secondary person who can help out and get to shadow a partner and see how they manage board meetings and also contribute in your own way. And then that gives people an opportunity to see what you're like in the boardroom and start to think, oh, could this person actually be the primary person in front of an entrepreneur, in front of other investors from other firms? So those are some of the things. But as I mentioned, I feel very, very fortunate that I got a chance to lead a number of investments in a bunch of companies that I continue to be super psyched about to this day.
And on that, how do you navigate being an effective board member at such a young age? Where do you feel that investors in general add value?
It's interesting. If you talk to the companies that I worked with, I wonder if they consider me an effective board member, if they were being like super honest. I think that there were definitely some places where I added value. And then there were certain places where I was probably like extremely naive or just having had no experience ever running a company before, very limited board experience. So I want to be like humble to that fact. One thing that I had to offer that a lot of folks don't was just like raw energy and hustle. It's like, oh, you're looking to grow your sales pipeline? Let me go spend 10 hours this week just like digging up prospects for you. Oh, you're looking to hire a chief of staff? Like, let me go ping like 30 people in my network who might be interesting. So it helped a lot with hiring and with sales. And then also I helped a lot with fundraising. So when companies needed to go and raise more money, making introductions, helping entrepreneurs think through the process, that was something that I was pretty good at because of where I sat in the firm, just like seeing a lot of these deals happen. Yeah, and introduced companies to a number of folks who ended up investing in their businesses. So the thing that I contributed most probably was just being a hustler and being willing to go and help with a bunch of things and kind of like make introductions happen and things like that. But I was also pretty good with numbers. So that was another place where I would help out. Let's talk through your financial model. Oh, like board meetings coming up. Let me know if I can help like think through something in advance. So sometimes I would get phone calls from entrepreneurs where they're like, hey, like before going to the board, I'd love to just like get your feedback on X, Y, and Z. I was kind of seen as like a friendly voice that I'd be willing to roll up my sleeves and do a little bit of work. So those are some of the things I focused on. But now on the other side of the table as an entrepreneur, I had no clue what it was like building a business. So there was a lot of places where I probably asked questions or contributed in various ways that entrepreneurs were probably very kind about it, but they're probably rolling their eyes a little bit at some of the things that I would have asked.
Yeah. And so moving on to Standard Metrics, maybe you can give some background on what Standard Metrics is today. And then also would love to hear about, was it a problem that you saw at Spark or just in general in VC? What was the catalyst for what starts in the metrics?
The venture capital industry, in the private equity industry too, it's interesting because it's this asset class that's grown tremendously over the last couple of decades, particularly over the last decade. Over the last 10 years, rough numbers has gone from $2 trillion asset class to $5 to $6 trillion asset class. A lot of that obviously driven by low interest rates, but just huge amounts of capital have been poured into this industry. In venture, between like 2011 and 2021, obviously 2021 was quite a peak, grew about a factor of 10 in terms of capital deployed per year. It went from like 60 something billion per year globally to 600 something billion per year globally. So you have this asset class that's grown tremendously, especially venture, but also PE, but has still never really adopted software before. There are some software companies, of course, and we do have competitors. Most of the folks in our space are owned by large conglomerates. It's essentially a space that operates like Microsoft Office, pencil and paper, sticky notes, email. And that can actually like work pretty well. But oftentimes what happens is that firms start to scale, things start to break. And there's also issues on the portfolio company side, on the LP side, et cetera. So one of the challenges that I noticed when I got to Spark was around how do firms keep track of all the data that they have for their portcos, how their portcos are doing, for their investments, how their investments are doing, for their funds, how their funds are doing, all of the materials that they create, the way that they collaborate and have conversations, all of these rituals that occur like Monday morning partner meetings, portfolio reviews, LP reporting. All of those things essentially happened in this like disparate web of different systems that are primarily kind of office based. It felt to me like there's an opportunity to pull that into a collaborative online platform. So that's really what we're focused on building. The first problem that we're working on solving is around the portfolio data collection and portfolio data utilization side of things. So how do we make it really easy for firms to collect data at scale on all of their portfolio companies, and then pull that into a central database and layer a bunch of really useful tools on top of it for analysis, reporting, API, exporting, all that kind of stuff. And then on the company side, it's funny because there's the same problem where you have all these investors, they're all pinging you, asking you for kind of the same information. How do you get all of them on the same page? How do you like take control of that process? And so there's this one-to-many problem on both sides that exists in venture that's really exciting. So there's a network, or there could be a network, although there hasn't really been historically. So that's what we're focused on building, is this financial reporting focused network, starting in the venture and startup space. Things that I experienced when I was at Spark, things that I saw with friends in the industry when I worked there, really rewarding to build a product that directly addresses something that frustrated me when I worked in the industry.
Right. Very helpful. So we'd love to start with the early days of Standard Metrics. Talk to us about how you worked with your earliest customers or beta users to take the product from something that was more of an idea or focused on kind of one feature to a broader platform.
The founding story of Standard Metrics is interesting. So we were originally called Quaster, and it was this partnership between myself and this team of entrepreneurs out of 8VC, who's our lead investor. who led our seed round as well as our Series A round. And 8VC had the exact same problems that I had when I was working at Spark. They tried a bunch of things, nothing worked. And eventually they said, we need to fund a company that's going to go and try to digitize all of these different processes and data for the private capital markets. So I met them right as I was transitioning out of Spark. I told my partners, hey, I'm ready to go and start a company, gave me their blessing. I went and spent time with the folks at AVC. And it was cool because they had actually started building a product internally already. We ended up rewriting, I think, all of the code from that. But it was like they had built a prototype that AVC was actually starting to use internally a little bit. And so we had the beginnings of like customer validation from them. And then there was one other firm that was also starting to use it. It was free at the time, but like, just give us feedback, let us know how this is working. And so we had these 2 pilot customers. And what we did is we spent a ton of time with those pilot customers in the early days, just building and iterating and iterating and iterating and trying to find something that would really solve a deep problem for them. In the meantime, we also went and spoke with other customers, brought on other pilot customers and started working with them. What we kind of figured out was that this data collection problem was the one that we wanted to really focus on. How to make it easy for companies. And we built some cool stuff there, which I'm happy to talk through around integrations to just like automate reporting needs. And then on the investor side, how do we give people one place where they can run this entire workflow to go and collect all of the information from their portcos really simply? And that's what we really focused on building. And that's ultimately what we found product market fit with sometime in probably 2021 and began kind of monetizing the product and selling the product in 2021.
What indicators kind of give you the inkling that you found product market fit? What do you define that as?
One of the obvious heuristics is, do people want to buy your product? But that doesn't mean that they actually like love using your product. It might just mean that they have a pain point that they think your product can solve. So some of the things that we started thinking about was around usage. How much were people using it? How often were they logging in? What were they willing to provide us positive references and testimonials on our website and things like that? So those are a couple of the heuristics that we use. Another interesting one is you can also just like ask people. There's also just survey questions you can ask around how disappointed would you be if you could no longer use our product and things like that. The next series of things that was kind of counterintuitive almost is like, how much do customers complain when there's bugs? Because if there's bugs and they don't complain, like that's a big problem because that means that they don't care, they're not using it. But if they complain really aggressively, it can be bad because they're frustrated, but it also shows that they care. So that was something that we looked for a lot in the early days. How much are people getting on our case when there's bugs? And there's always going to be bugs, especially when you're building like early stage software. And then over time, we started looking at things like renewal, like our customers renewing for a second year, are they renewing for a third year, are they signing multi-year contracts and things like that. Yeah, as I mentioned before, definitely moving target. And we're always iterating on our product to try to make sure that it meets our customers' needs and solves their problems.
So on that, how is your ideal customer profile or ICP evolved over time? Who are you typically selling to, and how do you plan to expand your ICP at all?
So when we started selling our product, we were experimenting and figuring things out. And anyone who was interested in talking with us were so delighted that someone was interested in learning more about our product. And we still are excited to talk with a wide variety of different investors. I'd say that over time, we've probably focused more and more and more on building out tools that help investors with, I would say, like medium to large size portfolios. Someone who's just getting started, who has a couple of investments, we're totally happy to support them. And we have a number of customers like that we love working with. But what we find is that oftentimes the value of our tool increases as somebody has more and more and more data to work with. That's driven us to go and build a bunch of features, for example, like an API, so that firms can suck data out of our platform into a warehouse to join with other data for analysis if they want to. Or some of the larger firms are also building out their own in-house software, and they might want to query and pull data out and then ultimately in the future push data back in from in-house tools that they're building. That's some of the changes that have occurred over time, but we really do support a very wide variety of different investors, from investors with like less than $50 million in assets, and then we have a number of investors that have more than $10 billion in assets. So quite a broad range in the size of our investors.
And I'd imagine the sales cycle varies pretty significantly across the range as well.
Yeah, that's correct. Obviously, larger investors, especially ones that are regulated, RIAs. We also have publicly traded companies as customers. There's different processes around InfoSec and legal diligence and things like that that can change the nature of the sales process. And sometimes more decision makers involved. Sometimes in smaller firms, it's like one of the partners is personally running this. Whereas in a much larger firm, it might be somebody on the portfolio. There could be somebody in the portfolio data operations or someone on the finance team who might own it. Differences in sales cycle for sure, based on the size of the customer.
So I'd love to hear a little bit more about your vision for the future of portfolio management and LP reporting more broadly.
When we think about what we're building right now, there's a lot that we can do to make the experience better for companies and for investors. Our vision ultimately is to build this really large, robust network that becomes the default place to go and do investor relations, either as a portfolio company or as an investor. If you're a portfolio company, all of your investors are already using standard metrics. So it's the obvious tool to want to adopt. If you're an investor, all of your portcos are already using standard metrics. So it's the obvious place to go and engage with them. Now, as far as like what we want to build around that, there's a lot that's on the roadmap. Taking the investor side, there's a lot that we can do to make the experience better, not just for collecting data, but also for how data is analyzed on our platform. So more and more robust analysis, reporting tools, and investing more into our API as well. That's something that we're really, really focused on right now. As I mentioned before, a lot of like larger, more sophisticated firms are starting to spin up their own engineering teams. And we see that as like a really important trend in the industry, as well as thinking to the future for building more interoperability with other systems that exist out there, because we are not a monolithic tool that solves every single problem that a VC firm might have. There are aspects of like the back office, for example, operations and finance operations that we don't touch. And I think there's probably places where partnering and building integrations makes a lot more sense. On the company side of our product, we've built a tool that we're really proud of, but there's a lot that we can do, I think, to make it solve new and interesting problems for companies. I think one of the areas that we're really excited about exploring over time is how do companies understand the context around their own performance? For example, like when I submit information to my investors on standard metrics, I'm submitting a bunch of data points, and those data points live in the ether. Wouldn't it be interesting for me to know, gosh, I'm really exceeding expectations around this metric, but I got to watch out for this metric because I'm actually kind of struggling here. How can we create better collaboration between investors and companies to help investors to share that information with companies, and potentially over time even broader aggregated kind of like benchmarking tools, both for investors and for companies, to help people put their performance into context? So that's something that we're really excited to be exploring. And there's a bunch of other things, of course, that we want to build too. I'd say on the LP side of things, that's not an area that we're focused on right now. What I will say is that GPs that use our platform will oftentimes create content that is then shared with LPs around company performance, investment level performance, fund level performance. And we see a lot of opportunities to help to streamline that engagement between GPs and LPs.
You touched on earlier Excel, manual spreadsheets are what funds or companies using today, but there's also a few other companies out there, early stage startups who are trying to solve a similar problem. So we're curious, like who do you view as your main competitors or who are you usually displacing?
So we're almost always displacing Excel. There are certain cases where we're displacing a different competitor or going head to head with a competitor for a specific business, but this industry is still primarily spreadsheet based. Without going into maybe like too many sort of like specifics on the competitions, we want to be like respectful about different folks. There are a couple of different strategies that people are trying in the space, and they have their different merits. The first strategy that was tried in this space, which really kind of dates back to like the early 2000s, and some of our kind of like larger existing competitors, is very investor-centric, analysis-centric tools, where it's really about like, hey, you're the investor, let's get all of your data loaded up. We're going to get the data in probably through spreadsheets and kind of like uploading spreadsheets and scraping spreadsheets for data. And then once the data is in the tool, we'll then provide a bunch of analysis that you can use internally around your investments and the performance of your companies. I would refer to those maybe as like the single player kind of analytical approach. Then there's another approach that we've seen, which is let's build a bunch of tools to automate internal analysts' work. So let's make it really easy for a team of analysts to like pull data out of PDF files, pull data out of spreadsheets, and even build some automation into that process, so that not only can we track like where the data came from, but we can also speed up that process and then build a bunch of analysis around that. There's some newer players that are taking that approach. There's also people who are saying, let's focus on valuations and providing software and services around valuations, and then back into data collection from there. And then finally, there's some other companies. There are one or two other companies that are taking more of a network-based approach like we are. Obviously, we think that that's the winning strategy, really thinking about building a two-sided network and creating value for both sides and kind of winning through the network as well as through the individual features. So those are like three strategies that I would like highlight that we see out there.
What are some of the key features of the Standard Metrics platform that enable investors and startups to automate some of this tracking of financial data more effectively?
On the startup side, the biggest thing that we do, there's really two things. One is we allow startups to plug in with key systems of record, like their accounting system, banking system, and payroll system, pull that data into our platform automatically. So they have this essentially like a repository of data that just grows over time. We give companies the ability to like create different views on top of that, create charts, graphs, etc. And then the second part is when investors ask for information, if that data is available in the system, it'll just autofill it. An investor says, hey, it's the end of Q1. We'd love for you to send us January, February, March revenue, January, February, March cash, January, February, March net income, January, February, March gross profit, gross margin, whatever. That data will just like magically populate. And then companies have the ability to like review that and ship it off versus having to go and like manually copy and paste data and wrong format, wrong currency, mistakes, fat finger, all sorts of issues come into play there. So on the company side, we're really focused on trying to like take as many steps out of that process. Oh, you uploaded a document for one investor, great. If another investor asks for the same document, it's already there. You don't have to go through that whole process again. For investors, there's a bunch of automation too. So one of the key workflow tools we've built is the idea of like an information request. We allow investors to essentially set up this campaign that they can like heavily customize by company, by sector. There's all sorts of different ways that they can modify it. And then we provide this tool that allows them to send these requests. They send reminders. They can see data that's kind of like filtering back into the system. They can tie that data with various reports automatically that get populated as data comes in. That's like a whole body of work and a really important part of our product. There's also the API, which I mentioned before. So what a lot of investors are doing now is they're using our tool to go and collect a bunch of data. And then they're automatically pulling that data out, into a warehouse or into their own software. And so that provides this like key workflow that we're a part of that allows investors to go and perform like a bunch of bespoke analysis because people are always going to have things that they want to do that we're not going to be able to cover on our platform. It's impossible to cover every edge case. So those are a few things that I'd highlight on both sides right now.
On that data element, obviously, I think there are a lot of trends behind AI and the importance of data and specifically proprietary data. And Standard Metrics has plenty of that on the platform. Given that, how are you kind of thinking about ways to leverage artificial intelligence within the platform?
Yeah, there's a bunch, and we're really excited about it. I do agree. I think now is like a really interesting time to be building a business that's creating a valuable and proprietary data set. The way we think about it right now is that there's data ingestion. How does data get into the system? And then there's how's data used? AI can actually impact both sides of that pretty dramatically. So as far as how data is getting into the system, right now, there's a lot of data that gets into our system through these integrations that I mentioned. But there's also, of course, all sorts of different documents that companies have access to, whether it's financial statements or qualitative updates that they've written for their investors and things like that. How can we start to use new tools to pull structured data out of semi-structured or unstructured formats? That's one whole like exciting effort that I think will help us to pull data into our system faster, more reliably, larger amounts of data, et cetera, which has a direct impact on streamlining the IR process for companies and also providing better data to investors. On the other side of it, the question is like, how does data get used? How can we provide more insights to users based on their data? How do we allow users to query data in new ways that might be more intuitive? For example, right now, if you wanted to say, let me look at all of my companies and figure out the top 10 companies in terms of revenue, the companies force ranked from like lowest runway to highest runway or something like that. Those are things that you can do right now through our platform using a variety of UI elements, like filtering and sorting and things like that. Why can't you just ask questions of the data? Why can't you say, hey, what are my 10 fastest growing companies? Hey, like what are my 10 companies that are closest to running out of money? Those are questions you should be able to ask because ultimately they're effectively SQL queries. So I think there's going to be a whole bunch of creative stuff that we can do around the way that data is, insights are surfaced and the way that data is queried. Really excited to be like working on those in the future.
To end the episode, we'd like to wrap up with two questions. The first is what motivates you to work hard?
Starting a company is really, really tough. Honestly, it's so many ups and downs. We've been really fortunate with the early days of our company, getting started, being able to raise some capital, building a product that gained some traction. It's definitely the hardest thing I've ever done professionally. And there are some days where you wake up and there's bad news waiting for you in your email inbox, and you're like, oh gosh, this is going to be a tough day. It's really important to have something that sustains you during those difficult periods. For me, the most important thing, honestly, is working on something that I'm really passionate about. For some weird reason, I happen to be extremely passionate about the way that the venture capital and, broadly speaking, the private markets operate. I think that the private markets are this incredible source of powerful innovation, job creation. It's a really important part of our economy. And if we can make it work just a little bit better, I'm going to feel so proud of that and so good about that. That's kind of what keeps me going. And you have to kind of be a glutton for punishment to start a company, because it's insane hours and it's extremely stressful. And so my advice to aspiring entrepreneurs would definitely be pick something that you really care about, because if you don't really care about it, you're going to probably be kicking yourself a few years in. I definitely lean a lot on the mission of our company to sustain me when things are difficult.
What about a piece of advice to give your younger self?
One of the things that I really benefited from when I was at Spark and when I was at StartX too was getting to learn from entrepreneurs, see how they did things, understand some of the difficult decisions that they had to make. But when I started a company, I realized that some of those like secondhand learnings were really useful, but sometimes like hard to put into context. And so if I could go back and rewind the clock, I think I'd probably spend a little bit more time like at the operational level, trying to figure out how businesses worked day to day. That's been like the biggest learning for me, going from like academic track to investor to startup operator, is the day-to-day mechanics of building a business, of hiring, of performance management, of firing, of building a product. So I think I probably would have leaned in a little harder on understanding the nuts and bolts of what makes technology companies work day to day. Maybe got my head a little bit more out of the clouds. I was probably a little bit more focused on the technology and the financial models, and a little bit less on like the kind of like day-to-day ops. And it turns out that the day-to-day ops really, really matters. And if you do the day-to-day ops badly, it doesn't matter how exciting your idea is or whatever, your business isn't going to work out. That's probably something that I was missing a little bit when we first started the company, and I'm still working on now, obviously.
Well, I think we could keep going for a few more hours, but I think we'll wrap it there. John, thanks so much for jumping on and sharing your inspirational thoughts and advice.
Thanks so much, Will and Laura. It's really fun.